of the Salt Lake City Council for March 26, 2019. The first item on our agenda is a follow-up discussion regarding the Salt Lake City resident survey discussion that we had last week. I'll turn the time over to Libby Stockstill from the council office, as well as Kyrene Gibb from Y2 Analytics.
Thank you. So following up on last week's meeting, the council members have the draft of the survey questions in their packets and also printed off in your red folders with page numbers this time. So staff hasn't received any additional feedback from council members, but if you do have questions, Kyrene Gibb is here to speak on behalf of Y2 Analytics, who has created and will be conducting the survey. I do just want to note we did receive a message from the mayor's office that they would prefer to include the inland port questions that were discussed last week. And I also sent an additional email with a link to other questions that were discussed related to the port. So Kyrene is here to answer any questions or
Great.
take any
questions or comments from the council about this continued item. Councilmember Mendenhall.
If anyone else could go first,
Okay, if anyone else would like to speak before Councilmember Mendenhall. Councilmember Johnston.
To let Councilmember Mendenhall gather her thoughts,
Buster John.
I'd just like to say I support it. I like the inclusion of the question we talked about with the inland port. I would agree with the policy questions to publish for public viewing. I'd like this to hopefully grow into a consistent format to gather information and get a sense of public perception of policy, and also maybe execution of that policy, what the impact is on the public. So I'd like to set the precedent now to make sure that's consistent and public and clear.
Okay, thank you, Councilmember Johnston. Councilmember Mendenhall.
So Libby, I'm sorry to possibly make you repeat yourself, but it sounds like the administration is saying they don't want us to touch anything about any of the inland port questions. Is that what I'm hearing?
The message I received is that the mayor's office would prefer to leave them as is and in the survey.
Okay. And I am failing to remember the name of the other representative from Y2 who was with us last week. Will you remind me?
Scott.
Scott, thank you. He seemed to understand, maybe he's just a really good listener, an affirmative listener, seemed to understand some of our concerns about the way that it was worded.
Absolutely. So I think given those concerns, the objective here is to replicate research that is being done by other entities about the project. So our proposal is just to replicate those questions and the question wording so that we have a representative sample of Salt Lake City residents to sort of compare those external results against. If that policy objective is not the direction the city wants to go, I see no reason why the questions we have here have to remain as they are. So it's more a question of objectives tied to the content and structure of the questions as they're currently worded. But if the idea is to be able to sort of validate or see how Salt Lake City residents compare to the broader survey population among the other organizations' survey results, then we would recommend leaving the wording as is.
I think I'm not looking to remove things necessarily, but that back to what we talked about last week, that it does feel like we're missing a piece about or in an attempt to evaluate people's understanding of the issue.
Yes. And I think to that point, we did alter the question wording for the first inland port question to be how well would you say you understand the project rather than just baseline familiarity, sort of as an attempt to raise that baseline cognitively. So familiarity is a little bit of a lower bar.
Right.
We altered that to understanding.
Okay, so I can change that in the draft that I have. That
Yes.
How much do you understand? Or
yeah, so
something
the
along those
question
lines?
wording now would read, how well would you say that you understand the Utah Inland Port Development Project? And that includes a 5-point scale from extremely well to not well at all.
Okay. Could I also submit, maybe for my peers' consideration, that in terms of ordering, so I'm looking at page 12. The bottom of page 12 is the first one. And then on 13, I think that it may be more logical for us to reorder and do the favorable to unfavorable rating at the end of the question about the importance of the following items.
Maybe talk me through your reasoning on that a little bit.
So everyone will be somewhere, or will evaluate themselves somewhere on a scale of understanding or not having sufficient understanding. And then we would ask them about, the intro has quite a bit more text about what the port concept is. And then it would go through some items related to the port and allow them to contemplate their prioritization of those items. And I think going through that process helps the mind on any subject, to both being briefed briefly about what it is and thinking through one's priorities on the different concepts to then have a feeling about whether they're favorable or unfavorable about it.
Understood. My pushback on that would be that if we want to get a baseline favorability from those who say that they have an understanding of the project, it's better to ask that before we introduce additional considerations. So that's why the question ordering is as it stands currently.
You're the expert. I'm just trying to,
Yep.
when I think about if I were asked these kind of questions and say I fell right in the middle of the scale of understanding and rating myself, that it would probably help me get a better feeling for the potential of the port as it's described. And
Yeah. Given that consideration, I think we could ask a follow-up question after the introductory text and those other considerations are presented. But I do think for the baseline and for those who say they have an understanding of the project, it would be best to have sort of an unbiased representation of how they feel before we look at these sort of value propositions.
okay, I appreciate that. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Mendenhall. Any other discussions? All right, then I think we are good to move forward with the
Okay,
survey. So thank you both for your time.
great, thank you.
Appreciate it. The next item on our agenda is an ordinance for 2058 North, 2200 West zoning map amendment. Brian Fulmer from the council office will lead this discussion. He'll be joined by Kelsey Lindquist, the senior planner, and Wayne Mills, the planning manager.
Good afternoon. This petition is about changing the zoning of this parcel, which is a little more than 2 acres, 2.5 acres rather, from agricultural to Ag 2 to M1 light manufacturing. It will more closely align with the future land use map and the master plan for the area. And I will turn the time over now to Kelsey.
All right, and this should be brief, but okay, there we go. So this is a request to amend the zoning map of the property located at 2058 North, 2200 West from AG2 to M1 zoning district. The applicant is seeking the amendment to implement the future land use designations noted in the applicable master plan. And the M1 zoning district does align with the future anticipated use of the property. The property is approximately 2.65 acres in size and abuts AG2 zoning to the east, partially on the west. The north and west are currently zoned BP, and the properties to the south are zoned M1. The previous map amendments took place along 2200 West and rezoned AG properties to M1. The amendments took place in 2017 and incorporated mitigation measures to ensure adequate buffering between future commercial developments along 2200 West and the remaining agricultural zoning and uses. The proposed M1 zoning would provide the required buffer yards due to the proximity of the existing AG2 zoned properties. The Planning Commission forwarded a positive recommendation to the council, and we are here to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Questions from the council? Councilmember Rogers.
Yeah, this is a really hot area currently along 2200 West, especially right here on this corner. The 2060 is currently used as residential. There's a family that lives there. I understand that they're in discussion with purchasing that property. Where are they with that? Because I don't feel comfortable moving forward with a zoning change without that parcel being included.
Okay. The applicant is actually here to answer any questions about where they are in that purchase agreement. I can't answer where they are currently, but they would be happy to answer those questions.
Great. Mr. Sheriff, you're fine with that?
Yeah, no, let's invite the applicant forward. Typically, we'll give zoning applicants about 5 minutes to speak. So if you could each introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about the project that you want to rezone it for, and then address Councilmember Rogers' question.
Right. So my name's Nick Smith. I'm one of the owner's representatives for Salmon Investments, which owns the property.
And I'm Sean Johnson, another representative.
And so currently, yeah, we have been in discussions on and off with the person that we horseshoe the property around currently. It's still in debate as to, how much and things like that, of what we're going to pay for the property, or if, things still seem to be moving forward with that currently. And as far as like what we're seeking to zone a M1, as you see, and there's just multiple different things we're looking to possibly do with the property. It could be anything from, storage units to doing something like the development that's going to be to the south with a little bit of flex space. So there's been different options entertained there. Owner's still kind of making a final decision as to which route he's going to go at this time, though.
Okay.
I know that you've presented to the community council there. There hasn't been a recommendation either way. I just know that this family's been there for generations, right?
Yep.
So, and it's just 75% of their property is going to be surrounded by, manufacturing. So for me, it's going to be a difficult sell. I'm going to go visit them and talk to them and see where they're currently at with them. But it's a really difficult situation that they're being placed in.
Councilmember Mendenhall.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I noticed that it says that the owner at 2060 has not expressed concern or objection, but does that mean that we've heard from them?
I have not heard from the owner at 2060
Have
throughout
we
the process.
solicited direct feedback from them?
Yeah, they received several notices.
Surely in the mail.
Surely, yeah, in the mail, and then about this as well as the Planning Commission. I contacted the Community Council. They also didn't request a meeting. I only received one public comment, and that was from the property owner to the east.
So I'm going to look to James for
I've heard from them.
the feedback that you have to give us.
So I've heard from him. I'll go visit him again. But, they're simple people. It's just plain and simple. I'm sure this process scares them. Do you know what I mean? So it's a totally new venue for them. That it is what it is. But I'm going to go visit him again and talk to him.
So a question that I have for the applicants, do you, are you under a time crunch? I mean, is there something that's imminent that you're planning on doing with the property? Is there, if we were to, so if Councilmember Rogers goes and meets again with the family who lives in that area that you horseshoe, would that in any way hinder what your immediate plans are for that site?
Currently, no. I mean, we'd like to move forward as quickly as possible, but it's not going to hinder us at this time.
Okay. Other questions or comments? Councilmember Wharton?
Just quickly, is this close to the southern part of this? Is that near the entrance to the Duck Club? Or am I way too far
so.
east?
Too far east.
Okay.
But it is the road, that 2200 north is the road that takes you west to the duck boats.
Okay, but this isn't the one that's like right adjacent to the entrance. Okay.
Okay, if there are no further questions, council members, what I would like to do, and I'll look to the applicants as well, as I make this recommendation. So we have on our consent agenda tonight a motion to set the public hearing date. I would recommend that we remove that so that we do not set the date for the public hearing. We give Councilmember Rogers time to go and meet with the family, give the applicants some time to continue talking with them and see if there's some sort of consensus that can be reached. And then next month we can follow up with planning staff to see how those discussions and deliberations go. And at that point, we can set the public hearing date. I just don't want to make anyone feel like they're being unnecessarily rushed or that they're being backed into a corner, with regards to what they're going to be doing with their property. So if that's okay to the council, that would be my recommendation moving forward. Does that work with the applicants as well?
Would that be a week from today, it sounded like?
No, so that would actually be next month that we would come back.
Okay.
So
We're currently just to the price point, really back and forth. If we purchase their property next week, then what would that do to?
yeah, if you purchase, I'm not hearing any concern about the rezone or the project overall. It's just that, where it's horseshoed around that residential property. I think if you're able to, purchase that, and that's as soon as that's concluded, just let the planning staff know and we can get you added back to the agenda.
The other thing that we're currently discussing with the landowner, they would like to shift their property so that it kind of makes our shape more Utah-like. Is that something that would be more appeasing to you?
Let me just talk to him first, and then we can, and I'd love to meet with you offline, and we can go over it as soon as I talk to him.
Cool.
Yeah, but if you're okay with that, we'll pull the item from the consent agenda tonight. Item 2, thank you. And then we'll reschedule this as soon as y'all have had those discussions. Okay? All right. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Yeah, Councilmember Mendenhall.
Probably of Kelsey. And I'm looking through, maybe I'm missing it, but if we end up bringing this back, I know that the future land use map for the area contemplates M1. Could you give us a little bit bigger, or maybe you could even follow up with an email, perspective of the broader zoning of the area currently? I know that often when there's a future land use contemplated that we haven't yet started to rezone to, that these initial conversations of rezoning an area can feel abrupt and
So, Councilmember Mendenhall,
I just
if
wanna
you
understand
remember years ago, we rezoned the entire 2200 West corridor up to this point because this family did not want to be included in the rezone.
that's the kind of context I'm looking for.
So
Thanks,
the
James.
property to the south of it is zoned M1, but this is not zoned M1.
Thank
My
you for that.
apologies if that wasn't clear. So in 2017, 2200 West, outside of a handful of AG2 properties, it was all rezoned to M1, and planning allowed the AG2 properties to do it at their own discretion.
Correct.
Thank you. I'm looking at the timeline on that. If you could just send me a map, that would
Of
help.
course.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, council members. My microphone was off. The next item, I actually want to shift the agenda a little bit because I know that Jen Covino is here. So let's move number 4 to right now, and then Jen can give us our federal legislative update, and then she can head out to dinner or do whatever she wants to do. And then after Jen finishes, we will talk about budget amendment number 5 for fiscal year 2018 and 19. So welcome.
Thank you for having me all tonight. It's great to see some of you again. A number of council members were in Washington, D.C. to attend the National League of Cities a few weeks ago, and we made the rounds on the Hill. For everyone else, I'm Jen Covino. It's great to see you again. I'm excited to be back here in Salt Lake City with you all tonight to provide a federal affairs update. In the interest of time, because it is limited, I went ahead and basically tried to focus on your federal priorities as I understand them to the best of my ability. But I want you to know that I am an open book, and if you all have any questions about other recent developments involving a certain investigation, glad to answer any questions you might have at the end. So just wanted to provide an update for you following the midterm elections. As you can see in front of you, we've had some changes in our U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate. That's really important to understand the political dynamics back in Washington, D.C. We still have one House seat that's unresolved, and we'll be going to another congressional election, hopefully in the next month or so. Over in the Senate, things have largely remained the same, although we had changes in the House of Representatives. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is still controlling the agenda in the upper chamber. And I wanted to provide an overview for you of the discrepancies between the priorities in the two chambers of Congress. House Democrats got to action this year, enacting a new rules package that was intended to create greater transparency, greater democracy, and pursue some ethics reforms. We anticipate that the House is going to continue its oversight and investigation activities of the administration, despite there being a conclusion of the special counsel's investigation over the weekend. Under Speaker Pelosi's direction, we do foresee there being a lot more space becoming available in terms of our bandwidth in DC to focus on domestic policy and changes around healthcare, immigration, gun control, the minimum wage, equality, and infrastructure. The House Democrats actually today introduced a new healthcare bill. I'm glad to brief you a little bit about that. It came after a deadline today, the same day that actually the administration and the Department of Justice announced that it would be recommending in a federal court to not uphold the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. So there are developments happening in real time today. The House recently reestablished a 15-member select committee on the climate crisis, and that's being chaired by a congresswoman from Florida. They're going to be taking policy recommendations over the next 12 months to feed out to other committees of jurisdiction. And so I think it's a really great opportunity and time to engage with the House of Representatives on that issue. Over in the Senate, Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is continuing to maintain his focus on pushing forward judicial nominations. And the upper chamber has agreed, shares priorities such as infrastructure, healthcare, and lowering the cost of prescription drugs. Many foresee infrastructure as being a promising area for compromise, and Secretary Elaine Chao over at the U.S. Department of Transportation has been alluding to her hopes for a package being passed later this year. For the time being, given the state of affairs in D.C., we recommend maintaining a focus on existing formula and discretionary grant programs that are available to support your local projects and initiatives. As necessary, we're there to help you pursue legislative remedies or judicial review of any of the administration's executive actions or regulations that would preempt the local authority of the city. We anticipate that the congressional habit of governing by crisis or immediate deadline will continue as we move forward in the 116th Congress. And just an update that earmarks continue to be banned as they have been since 2011. We got updates in recent weeks from both Senate appropriators and House appropriators agreeing that the FY 2020 spending bills will not contain earmarks. There is potential for revisiting the earmarks conversation, looking ahead to 2021, and looking at other authorizing bills. And so in terms of governing by crisis, here are some authorizations that we know will have expirations between 2019 and 2020. The Fixing America's Surface Transportation Act, which is the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill, will expire next September. The Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015 has a 5-year authorization, and the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act will also be coming due for reauthorization in 2020. This should help guide some of your engagement priorities for the years ahead. We know that committees are going to start their work in earnest on these few bills over the next 12 months, and we're here to help you engage if you have any policy provisions to share with either the House or Senate. Just want to give you an overview of the top federal resources for Salt Lake City in the past 12 months.
Jen, do you mind going back real quick?
Oh, sure.
So on the FAST Act,
Yep.
is that mainly so public transportation,
I'm gonna
the UTA, or is it the high-speed rail? Or is it all of the above?
I will circle back on infrastructure in a second,
right.
give you a broader
Okay.
overview. So as you can see, going through your federal grants that have come to the city in the past 12 months, the FAA Airport Improvement Program has accounted for more than $22 million going into the airport, and a large number of your other major federal resources are coming from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. If you look moving forward with FY 2019 appropriations, some of which were just finalized on February 15th because we waited a few months beyond the start of the federal fiscal year to come to a resolution. Most of these programs will see level funding for 2019. So the numbers you're seeing here should be largely the same for 2019. Moving forward in 2020, President Trump's budget proposal once again seeks to eliminate program funding for both CDBG and the Home Investment Partnership Program, both of which are amongst your top 5 grants. Over the past several years, congressional appropriators have rejected these proposed cuts, and we've been meeting with members of Congress over the past month who are all largely agree that the president's budget proposal is a jumping off point, and so they tell us, both Republicans and Democrats, not to really fare those cuts. The House and Senate in the weeks ahead are going to have to come to an agreement to lift the budget caps enacted by the Budget Control Act of 2011. And so Congressman John Yarmuth of Kentucky is currently working with Senate negotiators now. They're hoping to find a 2-year deal to lift both discretionary non-defense spending and defense spending with parity. If you look at other appropriations for housing, which is one of your top priorities, you can see there were a lot of plus-ups across the board at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and these are a number of federal resources that may be available to support your initiatives around homelessness, affordable housing, and building density.
Mr. Chair, can I interrupt Jen for just a second?
Councilmember Mendenhall?
This was one of the big takeaways, and I think that there's some other grant opportunities too, but from our trip to DC that Jen shared with us, and I would love to be able to sit down with the great budget minds in the city council office leading up to our budget to look at those opportunities, and then just to help us be able to identify projects and programs in the city in the mayor's recommended budget that we'll see in May that maybe we could leverage with strong applications on some of these.
Is it okay if I make a comment too? I would ask that we could loop in finance on that, just to make sure that their grant writers are aware of all the, especially if there's any new
Absolutely.
opportunities. So we'll loop you guys on that.
And I believe, or maybe Jen, you could speak to your willingness to call into that kind of a meeting. And
Yeah.
I know you have an amazing amount of technical expertise on a lot of these funds.
Yeah, so we're more than happy. We're here 24/7 to support any of your staff here in the city. So if it's your finance folks who might have concerns with cost share or administration after the fact, we have technical expertise there. Then also your program managers, so folks from the departments who might be overseeing this on a routine basis, I highly recommend that they'd be involved in any discussion as well. The other good news is for all of the programs listed up on the board right now and anything that's included in this entire presentation, the city is either directly eligible as a lead recipient, and if it is not, another partner in the region would be. And so we can help connect you with other, whether it's a nonprofit, the county, or the state, but most of this is focused solely on local governments where you could apply on your own behalf. So circling back for infrastructure, there's some good news and some bad news. One of the hopes we all have is that any infrastructure package that would be forthcoming from the administration, from Congress, would be comprehensive and large and full of new funding. In recent months, I think given the discussions in DC around the federal deficit, it seems as though both the House and Senate are gravitating towards a surface transportation reauthorization bill for 2020 rather than a more comprehensive package. Again, the habit of of governing by mandate and by deadline, I think is influencing them there. And one of the issues that will come with any infrastructure proposal is finding a new revenue source. The Highway Trust Fund is not solvent, and so at some point, lawmakers will need to come up with a new revenue solution, and it's something we're very seriously contemplating. In DC, we've been engaged on a weekly basis with both the House Ways and Means Committee, the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. And so right now, Senate EPW is actually soliciting legislative requests for a 2020 Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill. We assume that they will largely preserve the framework of the FAST Act. However, there are a number of urgent issues that will need to be addressed this time around that affords us some opportunity to think big in terms of what we hope for. And so the first issue will be addressing the solvency of the Highway Trust Fund. Right now, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has introduced a proposal that would increase the federal gas tax by 5 cents a year for the next 5 years for a total increase of 25 cents. There's other proposals being floated, whether it's vehicle miles traveled or other fees on tires or imports. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem as though there is enough information that's readily available on those new approaches like vehicle miles traveled. The states that have demonstrations aren't quite far enough along in the implementation of those pilots for the federal government to feel comfortable going to scale with that nationally. So I do think that the most likely option we'll see would be increasing the federal gas tax, at which point, if the city is in favor of new revenues for transportation and infrastructure projects, the next few months will be a critical time to engage. The House committees would like to see a bill pass out of committee before the end of the springtime to allow them sufficient time to get to a full floor vote this fall, because I think the assumption is that looking ahead to a presidential election year, if a hard vote is not taken before the end of 2019, it may not be taken at all in 2020, and that would likely lead us to a short-term extension of the FAST Act. I know, Chair, you had asked if we would be preserving, traditional programs as they currently exist. I will say if there's an interest in directing more funding toward local governments, it's a great time to have that formal policy discussion right now, and I'm glad to work with you on any legislative language that might create a pilot opportunity. Say the city wants to explore autonomous vehicles, for instance. There's going to be a lot of research and development around that in the months ahead. There's also, I think, the potential to have a climate title included in the next surface transportation bill. That has never been done before, but there is a willingness on the part of both Democrats and Republicans to have some policy provisions regarding emissions standards. And so given all that's transpired with the administration in recent months with CAFE standards, which I'll circle back with in another second, I think there is some opportunity to revise policies over the next few months if you want to engage.
Okay, so I would say yes and yes.
Okay,
And
excellent.
if you have any other crazy creative ideas, let us know, because we like those.
Members of Congress,
I
right?
chime in. Crazy, great creative ideas. And
Okay, that's
when there's a map that the EPA produced when Tier 3 emissions and fuel were coming out that looked at the nation, and there's a red dot over Salt Lake City, Salt Lake County area, and it was the only one like that in my memory that is set to receive the greatest benefit from those emissions reductions through that. So, I mean, the EPA, and there's plenty of documentation that we wouldn't even need to produce locally to show that those kind of policy changes would be hugely beneficial for our watershed.
I will circle back with more information on EPA and air quality in another second. But yeah, so if there were to be an emissions title, there's no doubt that this region would be one of the great beneficiaries of that. And so look forward to exploring those ideas with you. Another idea that we'll revisit a little bit later is through appropriations language, asking the federal government to align its federal resources in support of infrastructure projects that serve and benefit opportunity zones. And so I will come back to that at the end of the discussion when we get into that. Moving on, with our focus on existing resources, the Build Transportation Discretionary Grant Program, we expect another round of funding to be released when Congress put forward HJ Resolution 31, the omnibus to fund us for the rest of fiscal year 2019. It included a provision that said to the U.S. Department of Transportation that it needed to get out the next solicitation for grant applications for the BUILD program within 60 days, which would put us around April 15th. So we're expecting a solicitation any day now. The city applied for a grant award in the last cycle, but DOT had received 851 applications totaling more than $11 billion in federal assistance when there was only $1.5 billion available. I would highly recommend that the city receives a formal debriefing on that application. USDOT will formally walk you through their entire evaluation process and tell you where there were strengths and weaknesses for your proposal. And then if the city decides to apply for this funding again in the next round, I just want you all to know that our staff is there to serve as a resource. We're there to help your grant writers and serve as initial peer reviewers. I say more than half of my job is teaching you all how to be as competitive as possible given the administration's priorities. So we're glad to help with that and to also draft letters of support on behalf of the congressional delegation. I know they're all eager to help support your grant applications.
Thank you. So have we done this, David? Have we followed up on this? Okay.
And we can,
All right.
yeah, we can schedule a debriefing too on behalf of the city anytime.
Okay. Thank you.
So just moving along with DOT policy and EPA, as you know, the Trump administration proposed a rule that would cut back the Obama-era vehicle emission standards for light-duty vehicles. And so there's a group of 17 states that are currently suing the administration because of this proposed regulation. If you look at it from an objective policy standpoint, the administration tried to justify the proposed rule on a basis that lighter vehicles would cause additional fatal accidents. And so when they did a cost-benefit analysis to justify the need for a new rule, they used new technology leading to additional fatalities. And so the state's attorney generals have picked up on that and are suing on that basis. So we'll see what a judge has to say about it, but it's worth noting that in February, the White House, DOT, and EPA released a joint statement after they had been negotiating with the California Air Resources Control Board for a number of months, saying that they were stepping back from discussions with California. The only reason that's important, California is one of the states that had a Clean Air Act waiver in which it was able to pursue its own more strict emission standards. So the fact that the White House is stepping back from engagement with California is not good news in terms of its intentions. They actually said in that same statement that they would go ahead and finalize a rule at some point later in 2019. So we are keeping an eye on the Federal Register every day for you guys. We're also keeping an eye on the courts. In terms of air quality, wanted to draw your attention to existing resources, once again, that are currently available to support your mitigation activities here in Salt Lake City. The EPA targeted Airshed grant program just received another $75 million in appropriations. And while congressional earmarks do not exist, I will say that of the discretionary grant programs, this one is basically designed for you and just a handful of other areas that are in a non-attainment zone as designated by EPA. Every year, they limit eligibility to perhaps the top 5 to 10 jurisdictions that would be eligible according to the greatest number of pollutants in the air there. And so if there was ever an opportunity where you're going to compete well automatically because of the limited eligibility, this is a program that I would encourage either the city to pursue or its partners at the state level, if appropriate. You know, to some it makes sense maybe for the state to pursue this on a larger scale, but the funding's there and it's dedicated to the folks down in the valley here. There's also the Diesel Emissions Reduction Grant Program, and that's specifically to help support the deployment of modern technology that would help local jurisdictions come into compliance with the Clean Air Act. And so that'll support new equipment or retrofits on diesel technology. So if there's a need to do any replacement or retrofitting within your municipal fleet, or on equipment, whether it's at the airport or somewhere else, I can give you the list of eligible pieces of equipment that can receive that funding.
Councilmember Mendenhall.
And could an entity like the Inland Port Authority apply for these?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so where the city may not have the staffing capacity to do so, I do recommend, you know, having a a level of engagement with other jurisdictions, whether it is that board. I'll look up the eligibility on this. For certain grant opportunities, it's open to either units of state or local government. Others have broader eligibility where a special district government, such as a port authority with oversight of air quality control, is eligible. So I will refer back and check the language on this, but I do believe they can apply for that.
And will you, if you didn't already say it, tell us what the timeline is on those applications?
So these have yet to be released. EPA just finalized its budget for FY 2019, so we're seeing a lot of grant programs come out now. If we miss the cycle for 2019, the good news is that we're already looking ahead to 2020 starting on October 1. So another cycle would be just around the corner. And these programs have enjoyed support from both sides of the aisle historically.
That's great.
Yep, and just to make you all aware, if there are any programs of interest, right now we're in the middle of budget and appropriation season, so if you want us to submit any appropriations requests informally on your behalf, the subcommittee deadlines for most committees of jurisdiction just passed on March 28th. But as you know, from making the rounds on the Hill, we had the opportunity with several council members to identify some resources that are of interest. So in an informal way, our delegation is aware of these programs that might be of interest to us in the future. Just going down the list in terms of other items of concern with the environment, we also have appropriations for both clean drinking water and wastewater infrastructure projects. And so water resources are up there for you. There's also WIFIA, which is a revolving loan fund for water and wastewater projects, if that's of interest to you or your partners in the state.
Councilmember Valdemoros.
I have a question for council. For the first two, is this something that transportation has done in the past, or just sustainability, or both? Do we know that?
So I'm looking to finance a little bit, but it really depends on the project, and each department would sort of evaluate on the specific project if there were specific things that fit the grant criteria. Sometimes we miss grant opportunities because we don't know about them, and so the departments don't know to apply for them. But I can't think off the top of my head about these specific projects, any that would qualify. I think the water infrastructure finance would likely be public utilities, but we have such favorable bond ratings that oftentimes we get cheaper financing in-house, and we have the capacity to borrow, so sometimes that's more favorable. But it's important to evaluate, and so that'll be part of our follow-up with finance, just to make sure we're maximizing that.
For federal credit assistance programs over the past 12 months, we've seen anywhere from 2.8 to 3.1 as sort of being the interest rate there. There's some variation between DOT and then EPA, but we're always glad to check in. One other item just to point out for you that I haven't included here, but over at Federal Transit Administration, there's also a lower no emissions vehicle program that supports the deployment of lower no emissions vehicle technologies and related infrastructure. And so as the city prepares to implement its master transit plan, in the years ahead, I think it might be worthwhile for you all to encourage your partners at UTA to prioritize seeking those federal resources as opposed to the traditional bus and bus facilities resources, just as another way to incentivize a decrease in emissions.
Councilmember Mendenhall.
I was just trying to whisper that the Inland Port Board should be going after those infrastructure dollars too.
Okay. Yeah. And so let us know if we can ever help guide you or your partners toward any of those resources. Moving on to public safety, which I know is another big priority for the council. As you may be aware, over the past year or so, the city of Chicago had filed a lawsuit against the Trump administration around certain policy provisions related to sanctuary cities. The only adverse impacts of that for Salt Lake City, as far as we're concerned for the time being, is that it has put on hold a number of different grant solicitations administered by the Department of Justice, including the COPS hiring program, the Burn Justice Assistance Grant program, and also the COPS Office's Community-Oriented Policing Development Grant program, meaning that jurisdictions around the country are unable to access any of those federal grant dollars, and that's been the case now since the fiscal year 2017 grant rounds. And so that is hundreds of millions of dollars that are being held up by this lawsuit. Unfortunately, there's no further update on that lawsuit at this time. Otherwise, if you go through the FY 2019 omnibus, Department of Justice did well in terms of resources for public safety. The Burn Justice Assistance Grant is funded at $423.5 million, which is a slight increase over enacted funding from FY 2018. There's also robust investments. If you look down the list here, for any of these opportunities that might be of interest to you or your police department, there's funding available for bulletproof vests. There's funding available for school violence prevention. Here, the COPS office has $25 million to give out for activities related to stopping school violence. There's an additional $75 million that will be administered by a separate office within the Department of Justice. The COPS office also has its anti-methamphetamine and anti-heroin task force programs, which require you to apply through the state. So that's one important thing to note. If there's any interest in that, you would need to partner with the state agency. There's also $10 million for preparing for active shooter training programs. Elsewhere in the Department of Justice, Second Chance Act had robust funding, so for any of the city's efforts involving the re-entering population, there's good funding available there. There's $347 million available for different grant opportunities to address the opioids crisis. The Violence Against Women Act has more or nearly $500 million worth of funding available this year. And lastly, there's going to be $75 million in grants going toward improving the national background check system.
Councilmember Mendenhall.
Jen, do you know if Salt Lake City's ever applied for or received money for the Violence Against Women? I'm sorry, I'm looking for it, but I don't see it. Oh, there. Yes. The Violence Against Women Act dollars.
I believe that either the city or nonprofit partner at some point has applied, and I believe been successful in the past.
Ben nod behind you.
Yeah, I'm not sure which fiscal year it was. It was not 2018. I know that just because I went through all the data recently, but there has been efforts in the past, especially around human trafficking and women and families. So there's actually a lot of different programs authorized under the Act. In the Office on Violence Against Women is the entity that directly administers those programs. So glad to flag those for you guys when they come around this year.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah, and DOJ just in general right now is issuing most of its solicitations. It is the busy season for grant opportunities in DC, and just to make you all aware, basically because the budget got backed up so far into February, these funds all have to be appropriated before October 1st. And so to get the funding out the door before October 1st, they need a 30-day intergovernmental review in September. They need to evaluate over the summer. So all the solicitations are going out either in April or May. So it's a really busy time. And so one way I think that's helpful to sort of manage priorities is just if there's good work you're already doing, programs that you already find effective and are looking to expand, it's an easy way to have your staff pursue a grant opportunity that only has a 30 to 60-day application window available, unfortunately.
Councilmember Fowler.
Jen, I have a quick question. It may seem a little bit random and you may not know the answer,
Sure.
but I know at the end of last year, the Congress passed the First Step Act.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if there will be any grant opportunities for us through the First Step Act to look at our prison systems and some criminal justice reform.
So they're in the process of implementing that, and some good news to share, I'm smiling when I say this, is that some of the first inmates who have had their records expunged under the First Step Act are now reentering society. It's really exciting to see some good federal policy taking shape. In the meantime, I will say, while DOJ and other agencies are standing up those programs, it usually takes about 12 months. And Congress needs to still appropriate funding for some of those programs. I would draw your attention to the Second Chance Act programs because a lot of those programs actually share a lot of the same DNA. But First Step will take it a step further and be a little bit more innovative. And so as soon as those opportunities come out, we're glad to share them with you. And also, if you have any interest in engaging with DOJ and the program administrators there, we're always glad to set up a conversation. Yeah.
Thanks, Jen.
Just rounding out our public safety and public health, The Department of Health and Human Services is also taking a lead when it comes to addressing substance abuse and mental health disorders, including the opioids epidemic. So in 2019, there was $4.4 billion of total funding appropriated for programs to respond to the opioids crisis. SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, had $1.9 billion for their block grant alone. In the state opioid response grants, we just about a week ago had another announcement of a supplemental funding availability from FY 2018 being distributed to states. So I know that Utah has already received more than $5.5 million. And so one thing that's important for us to just be aware of, SAMHSA has been having some issues with states not getting that money administered and down to the ground fast enough. So if you are seeing any barriers there, please make us aware for us to share with SAMHSA. It's something going on across the country, but also if there's opportunity to engage with the state for the state dollars, there's also grants, again, for local jurisdictions to apply directly. And one of them, actually, right now, there's a comprehensive opioids abuse site-specific grant opportunity that just was released in the Federal Register yesterday. So I'll be writing that grant memo on the plane home tonight. We'll get that right over to you. Just moving onward, again, with the issue of local preemption and keeping an eye on the courts. I know that the Federal Communications Commission recent orders on accelerating wireline broadband deployment by removing barriers to infrastructure investment has been problematic for a number of local jurisdictions in that it preempts local authority over the deployment of small cells technology and also sets a cost-based cap that would prevent local governments from collecting the full fees they're entitled to. The city of San Jose, California filed a lawsuit on behalf of more than 20 local jurisdictions, and it lost a stay, but it recently won a transfer from the 10th Circuit to the 9th Circuit Court of Appeals based on the fact that the 9th Circuit had ruled on this in the 1990s. So that was good news in terms of a local perspective. But in the meantime, Congresswoman Anna Eshoo of California has introduced a piece of legislation that would prohibit the FCC from enacting this order. The purpose of the bill, as you can see, is to ensure that that regulation has no force or effect. Just want to note for you all, HR 30 currently has no Utah sponsors, and it's a good opportunity to engage with our congressional delegation and get them on board, especially since we have so many former local elected officials now serving in Congress who should be understanding and sympathetic towards this. Moving onward, I sent to staff a little bit earlier. The administration is doing a good job taking a comprehensive inventory of all of its smart cities resources. I sent over a spreadsheet, want to make sure you all have it. If not, I'll send it again. But there's about 30 different programs that might be of interest to you all. They range to support activities ranging from energy and infrastructure to intelligent transportation systems and resiliency. It's basically a bunch of different grants from a bunch of different federal agencies. So take a look like that if smart cities are of interest to you, and please flag for us anything you want to pursue. Finally, just to close out my update, I want to share some news on opportunity zones. It was great to see that Salt Lake City has 7 different census tracts designated as opportunity zones. And I just want to share with you all some perspectives from around the country as you all get to work on the implementation. I won't go through all of the regulations with you guys. If you're not aware, an opportunity zone is a federally designated distressed community where new investments can be made for preferential tax treatment to spur economic development by providing benefits to investors. And so the state or the governor took solicitations of interest for different census tracts that would qualify, and in the end passed recommendations along to the Secretary of Treasury. And so 7 zones were ultimately designated here in Salt Lake City. And if you look at the map, not sure how many different council members have an opportunity zone within their district, but for any of you that do have one, I want you to know that you may be playing the role of salesperson for your opportunity zone in the months ahead. It's interesting with opportunity zones because this is the first real federal program where now there's no need for real engagement with the federal government anymore. Now that you have these zones designated, the time has come to turn to the private sector and engage with them. And so we've had our first batch of regulations be finalized by the Department of Treasury. Those regulations have largely governed investments in real estate investments within the opportunity zones. We're awaiting a second batch of regulations to govern investments in small businesses and other enterprises. One of the things I want you all to be aware of is, as of this point in time, there's no legal reporting requirement in place to measure long-term impacts of these investments. Treasury says that it will focus on creating a solution for reporting in the year ahead, but in the meantime, the philanthropic community, including the Kresge and Rockefeller Foundations, are taking a lead on creating meaningful partnerships with mission-driven Opportunity Zone funds in order to measure the impacts and outcomes for residents of the Opportunity Zones. And so one thing I think that's important for Salt Lake City to consider is what are the socioeconomic goals and outcomes you want to prioritize on behalf of the residents of your Opportunity Zones? How do you work to ensure that those developers who are going to pursue projects within your zones are delivering projects that have a community benefit and serve as an asset to the community and improve education and employment opportunities for folks located within those zones? And one of the ways that a city can incentivize those types of priority projects would be your additional financing incentives. So if the city were willing to provide tax increment financing, LIHTC or New Markets tax credits to layer on top of those Opportunity Zone benefits, there's nothing to preclude you from doing that. In fact, a lot of cities are establishing principles in which they would provide these additional incentives for projects that drive outcomes they want to see. So we would ask you all in the weeks and months ahead to consider what types of policy priorities you want to drive in your Opportunity Zones. I think that interagency and cross-sectional collaboration is going to be critical here as you work with regional partners. I will say that the state helps shepherd these zones into fruition, but there may come a day where it has to pick its favorite child, and so I would encourage every unit of local government to be prepared to be the best marketer, the best advertiser, the best salesperson for projects in those zones. We also work with Louisville Metro government. Mayor Greg Fisher has become somewhat of a national leader on the issue. He developed what he calls an investment prospectus, working with Bruce Katz, formerly of the Brookings administration, in Louisville and 4 other cities that went ahead with developing those initial investment prospectus. Want you all to know that it's a good idea and they want you to rob it from them. So I'm glad to share that investment prospectus with you. It's basically a catalog of different projects located within each of their different 19 Opportunity Zones, one of which is a medical district, one's a university district, one is a place where they're looking to create more dense, affordable housing. Each of those Opportunity Zones has their unique assets and different priorities that they want to come to bear in those Opportunity Zones. So consider different goals for each of the 7 zones. These are the funds that have been established with the national focus. As you can see, we're not talking about pennies here. We're talking about $500 million funds being established. And so in the weeks and months ahead, when you all feel ready to go, we are here to connect you with each of these folks in the private sector. We anticipate that they're going to have a very heavy presence in New York City, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle. We're already seeing funds be created. Keeping an eye out for Utah-specific funds. Just given some of the connections with Jim Sorensen here, I would think that this market will be well represented. But in the meantime, if you take a look at each of these funds, they each have a different mission. Some are affordable housing, others are infrastructure, some are energy. And so try to marry up funds with your priorities. So as you can see, there's about 20 different funds here that are national in scope. Recommend engaging with them as soon as possible. I think this is a case where the early bird is going to get the worm.
Councilmember Johnston.
Yeah, I think early on there was some speculation that this would not help affordable housing very much based on the terms and the length of time. Is that changing based on the funds that are being created because they're bringing other money in, or has something as fundamental being changed in how it's written?
I think from what I'm seeing, I would say nearly half of the funds are advertising themselves as wanting to work on an affordable housing portfolio. And I think one of the things that's very attractive to them our local government stepping forward, and for projects that may have some risk or not enough profit associated with them in the short term, I think that local governments layering on additional incentives like new markets tax credits and LIHTC are making those types of investments more
I
attractive.
think that's the key piece for us is the opportunity zone itself is not going to promote the housing. You have to have the LIHTC or other things that just pencil out. It doesn't help us. So I'm concerned that we're not having enough LIHTC, period, or other things. And if we're relying on this to be the affordable housing piece, we're going to miss out because this isn't going to drive that piece that I'm aware of. So
Yeah. Well, the other thing to contemplate about this is that the opportunity zone designation doesn't necessitate that, you know, the project is limited to affordable housing. You can offer incentives, and it can be a mix of affordable housing and mixed
Sure.
income. And so I think those types of deals might be more attractive.
Well, yeah, and I think that whole point was that affordable housing was not going to make money for a developer. These folks are investing money because they get a tax benefit long term by sticking around for 10 years plus.
Yep.
They're not going to make money off the affordable housing piece. They're going to make money off of something that generates revenue. And so I think we need to be very conscientious of that. And if we want housing as part of this, we have to layer that in on separately than the zone.
Yeah. And I will say there are some players that are better than others. Enterprise Community Partners, which is a major player when it comes to new markets and just community development in general. From what I hear, they're establishing a fund of their own. And so you would look to someone like Enterprise to be doing the right thing with this incentive. And even LIHTC Development Group and Fundrise, they seem legitimate and interested in the social impact investing side of it too. And so we're now seeing some cities actually go forward and execute deals. And so we're always glad to share them. So if you all have projects in your portfolio and you're wondering where the interest might be, we're here to sort of serve as your matchmaker. Again, you know, there's not really any more role for the federal government to play, but there's certainly an interest in seeing this program be successful and also ensuring that it's not going to some of the wrong things. Some of the first deals from what I saw were things that were less than stellar if you've seen them in the news. So I think there's an interest in promoting some good projects that deliver some good benefits to communities.
There's another question from Jennifer Bruno. No?
Can you help us think through from a process perspective based on Councilmember Johnston's questions? I think the city is often in the role of facilitator of projects. We're not, you know, the ones putting together the project, so we don't decide the LIHTC that's offered. We don't decide the RDA incentive that's offered. We're often just filling the gap. And so looking for that way to sort of, through a process, sort of regularly free up those dollars rather than just sort of project by project. I don't know if you could think about that.
Well, so I think if you were to develop a prospectus, I mean, it's a good time to have a policy debate here and now so that if you know your top priority is going to be affordable housing, saying that we're going to really prioritize our LIHTC investments toward these types of projects, having a clear-cut expectation of what you're going to invest in as a city. I know that might be hard, but putting a general principle out there to the private sector saying, hey, we want to be as attractive as possible as a market. Here are the conversations we've already had to address any of your concerns around zoning, for instance, other ordinances you all might have in place. And again, on the flip side of that, as much as you want to attract, you also want to attract the right types of projects. And so just establishing what those principles are for you all, I think it's a really worthwhile conversation to have, and especially even at the end of FY 2019, the New Markets Tax Credit Program needs to be reauthorized at the end of this year. And so there's some uncertainty there. I think we'll get that done. But in terms of having those resources available for the future, you know, it's another helpful tool to layer on there as well if you have any experience with new markets. All right, so we're just about finished here. Just wanted to make you all aware that we're there to support you all 24/7 if you have any questions. We're looking forward to just working on your behalf, and we'll continue to monitor legislative, regulatory, and grant opportunities for you all in the weeks ahead. My colleagues and I truly appreciate the opportunity to work on your behalf in Washington, D.C. I'm grateful to have the time to spend with you tonight. This is my cell phone number. I understand there are time zones. I'm available 24/7. I used to do grant writing myself, so if you guys are pursuing any grants in the weeks and months ahead, tell your grant writers they can call me any hour of the day. I'm used to deadlines, and I just really appreciate your time tonight. Any other questions?
Jen, thank you so much for your commitment to Salt Lake City and all the work that you
Thank you.
do on our behalf. We really do appreciate
Yeah,
it.
and also Len sends his best to all of you. He's sorry he's not here tonight. I think he has a little bit of fear of missing out with you all. Thank you.
Well, tell him he missed a lot.
Absolutely.
So, thanks, Jen.
Thank you.
We are going to bump item number 3 on our agenda, the budget amendment number 5 for fiscal year 2018-2019. We will talk about that next week. So we will go to board appointments right now. I know that Jeff Carlton has been in the audience for a bit, so we'll have him come up first. Jeff, if you could just introduce yourself and tell us why you are interested in serving on the Business Advisory Board.
Evening, everyone. My name is Jeff Carlton. The reason I probably am most interested is my wife and I have settled here in Salt Lake. We've been here for 10 years now. Before that, most of my business career was spent traveling. I ran large sales organization for financial services companies around the country and never really had an opportunity to plant the feet and to really get involved in the community. And my wife and I started a business, Mountain West Hard Cider Company, about 4 years ago. And that's up and running, and I've got some free time now, so I'm ready to inflict my talents on all of you.
Great. Questions for Councilmember Valdemoros?
What district are you representing then?
District 3.
District 3. Thank you.
Okay, Councilmember Fowler.
I just want to say that I've known Jeff for a little bit now, and I'm excited that you are going to be on this board. I think that your knowledge of small businesses and how to work with them and make them grow, and your knowledge of the city processes to get through all of that will be very helpful on the advisory committee, and I'm looking forward to it. And it's good to see you. So
Thanks very much. And you know, to your point, starting a business here, we've actually availed ourselves of quite a few city services. And, you know, for the most part, it's working, but I feel like I've touched just about every part of the city in one way or the other. So that's a perspective I hope that's helpful.
Great. Other questions? Councilmember Mendenhall.
I want to thank you for your willingness to serve. I think that the boards and commissions in our city that are staffed by residents as volunteers are one of the most uplifting and inspiring parts of of our city, and your willingness to be civically engaged. And I also thank you for the products you produce.
Oh, thank you.
Councilmember Wharton.
Well, obviously, I am also a big supporter of your business and what you've been able to bring to our neighborhood, my neighborhood. And you've just turned that area into a real, just transformed it into a community space, which I think is great. I did want to ask you, given your experience, both as your corporate experience and then as a small business owner, what do you think are the best opportunity? What opportunities does Salt Lake City offer that maybe other places don't?
You know, I've lived in, gosh, I think my wife and I counted the other day, 14 different places throughout my professional career. So 10 years in Salt Lake is you know, setting the roots. And this community has so many attributes that, you know, we moved here from Philadelphia, which was a big city, and all the wonderful things about a large city. You get so much of it here in Salt Lake. At the same time, you know, I lived in Indianapolis, and this has a much smaller, homey feel. I'm also struck, I think, by the fact that the city represents the state in so many ways. If you're flying in for a meeting, you're going to Park City because you're an out-of-town guest and attending a conference somewhere, you know, your best impression of Utah is Salt Lake City. And to that end, just the changes I've seen in the last 10 years have been, you know, significant and magnificent, and the changes just keep on coming, and I'm excited to be part of that.
Well, thank you. That makes me happy. That's exactly. Yeah, that's so great. Thank you.
It's all
If
do
you can,
you,
and
right?
if you can make Councilmember Wharton happy, you make us all happy. So, Mr. Carlton, thank you so much for your willingness to serve. You will be on the consent agenda across the hall in our formal meeting. You don't need to stick around for that.
Appreciate that.
But, thank you very much, and we look forward to working with you.
Thank you. I look forward to working with you too.
Mr. William Littig is here for an appointment to the Housing Advisory and Appeals Board. Mr. Littig, if you could just introduce yourself for those of us or those who don't know you, many of us know you, and tell us why you're interested in serving on the Housing Advisory and Appeals Board.
I washed my face to come to this meeting, and I took out my hearing aids. So you'll have to excuse me, but...
No worries. So tell us a little bit about why you are interested in serving on the Housing Board.
I live here. I've been past chair of Avenues Community Council. I've been on Landmarks for, 6 or 12 years, I forget. I had big shoes to follow because my wife was represented our district before me. I think it's important to be active in your community.
Great.
It's probably that simple.
Okay. Questions for Mr. Littig?
I'm just a little bit shocked you're not going on to the Arts Council.
I'm an artist.
I know.
And I apply for Percent for Arts grants. And not grants, but Percent for Arts commissions. And there's very little money, and I'm getting less of it. I wouldn't want to cut myself out of that small financial stream. I think it's a great board, and the Arts Council is very well run.
Well, District 1 has a lot of your art, so we appreciate it.
Oh, good.
Okay, well, Mr. Littig, thank you so much for your willingness to serve. Your name will be on the consent agenda across the hall. You don't need to stay for the formal meeting, and we really appreciate your willingness to serve.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I had my light on.
Oh, you did have your light on.
It's fine.
Oh, okay.
It's fine.
Well,
I just wanted to
Councilmember Wharton,
point out another excellent District 3 candidate and resident coming forward to help the community. So thank you.
You're welcome.
Great. Thank you. So we will now look to a report from the executive director or announcements.
Okay, 2 quick items. First is a reminder of your special meeting that is scheduled for Friday at 10 a.m. And that meeting will be here. And the purpose is to hear from a property owner and then consider whether to vote up or down on a particular item. So that will be coming up Friday at 10 a.m. And then I just wanted to point out that Thursday at 9:30 and at 10:30, council members have signed up to come to a couple of functions with the United Nations guests. So 9:30 on the West Steps, they're having a presentation, and then 10:30 to 11, there's a meet and greet in the council office. And there were 4 people who said they might be interested in the meet and greet, and that is Councilmember Wharton, Councilmember Valdemoros, Councilmember Mendenhall, and Council Chair Luke. So if we have 4, okay, there you go. Mind reader. Okay. All right. So we have 3.
Okay.
Okay, that's it.
And I don't have any announcements from the chair, vice chair. Mr. Vice Chair, do you have any announcements?
No.
Okay. So I'll look to Councilmember Wharton for a motion.
Yes. I can do it. No. Ready.
Okay, Mr. Chair, I move that we go into a closed session to discuss strategy related to reasonably imminent litigation.
Okay, motion.
May I, and advice of council.
Okay, motion by Councilmember Wharton, second by Councilmember Fowler. I'll roll call this. Councilmember Valdemoros? Fowler? Rogers? Yes. Mendenhall? Wharton? Johnson? Yes. And I am a yes. So we are in closed session.